Hey everyone, Andy here, and man is it time for nostalgia or what? Most games on this series I don't have too much nostalgia towards, and if I do, it's usually from games that I have fond memories playing at best 10 or so years ago. However, this game in particular might have a bigger place in my history than I initially realized. With that, let's take a look at the 2001 reboot of Spyhunter. Released in September of 2001, developed by Paradigm Entertainment and published by Midway, Spyhunter was a bombastic, action-packed driving game. It was a reboot of the 80s arcade game of the same name, which I'll talk about briefly later. This game is what I consider to be a reboot done right, capturing not only the spirit of the original, but turning the formula into something with a lot more depth. Because of this game's success, an entire series of sequels and spin-offs were made, including plans for a Spyhunter movie, starring everyone's favorite Hawaiian, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. I'll get into that later. First, let's look at Spyhunter. The plot is fairly simplistic, but it gets the job done. An evil corporation called Nostra, short for Nostradamus, producers of food products, biochemicals, genetics, e-commerce, and children's software, want to send Earth back into the Dark Ages by launching a set of EMPs. The game does a bit of retconning, stating that the main villains here are supposed to be the same bad guys in the original Spyhunter arcade game. Yes, believe it or not, this isn't a full remake, but rather a sequel. You take the role of Alex Sex, an F-15 fighter pilot who is tasked with stopping them with the high-tech G-6155 interceptor. This game also hints at Alec being the same protagonist in the original game as well. From there, it's a globe-trotting adventure that takes many pages out of James Bond films by having car chases in urban environments, beautiful vacation spots, remote jungles, and even a secret base. You'll be shooting at cars, trucks, boats, helicopters, and at one point a reverse-engineered knockoff interceptor. It's fun spy movie action all the way through. We start off with a dated but pretty fucking badass CG cutscene. Oh yeah, I'm digging this theme. That music in the background is the theme from the show Peter Gunn. It's made a number of appearances in other movies and games, with Blues Brothers being one of the most recognizable. The original developers actually wanted to use the James Bond theme, but they couldn't secure the rights, so they fell back on the Peter Gunn theme instead, and hey, it's pretty catchy. So we're finally introduced to the first level, and even though it's a pretty standard tutorial section, especially nowadays, it still does a lot of stuff really well. First, I love how the devs put in tiny little details to make the place feel all the more like a real test track. Nowadays, this whole area would be some sort of 3D simulation with holograms and shit. Here, it's just wooden targets, real cones, and fake towns. I love it. This tiny attention to detail is going to be a recurring theme this episode. Also, the controls are very smooth and responsive. I wasn't sure how they would have held up, considering I'm playing a PS2 ROM on a PC at 30 frames per second with an Xbox controller. But lo and behold, it's very solid. I have just the right amount of weight to feel like I'm driving a real car, but it also has the fluidity of an arcade shooter. I give the controls a thumbs up. This is a good time to explain how the mission structure works. Each level is a linear track that has one or two main objectives needed for completing the mission, with a few side missions along the way. The number of these side missions that you complete in a level corresponds with the number you have right here. In order to progress onto the next level, you need to gain a certain number of points. Now, rest assured, you don't need to 100% each level just to progress, though it will help. As long as you make sure you're focused on doing a couple side missions on every mission, you'll be alright. But these side missions provide a ton of replayability for the game, as they make every level chock full of varying tasks and objectives. In any other game, one mission would just be a single objective, maybe escort an ally or destroy 3 targets. Instead, here you have to do stuff like place trackers on important vehicles, scan trucks for Nostra equipment, use EMPs on certain weapons, shoot down missiles as they're launching. It's all there. Not to mention you do have a time limit, though you don't really need to worry about it considering how it gives you plenty of time to finish the level. So the second mission is where I personally think Spyhunter really makes the best impression, which is similar to the opening cutscene. You blast your way out of an evil corporate building and try to escape them on a German highway as they come pursuing after you with the most evil of intentions. Here we get a nice introduction to Spyhunter's great level design. If you follow the main path, you'll often be able to complete the main objective needed just to complete the mission and nothing else. However, there are plenty of little side roads and secret shortcuts that you can use to either reach collectibles or complete the side missions from earlier. Literally, after every mission, you'll always want to go back just to find what you missed, and completing a perfect run is pretty damn satisfying. But the real star of the show, oh man, is the G6155 Interceptor. Right off the bat, it's just a beautiful car to look at, and apparently the Interceptor was the very first thing that Paradigm designed before they'd even touched the rest of the game. This awesome car is loaded with plenty of tools to wreak havoc on your enemies. Right at the start of the game, you have dual machine guns, a rocket launcher, and the ability to drop an oil slick behind you. On top of that, the car can quite literally transform into a boat when you enter the water, and if you take too much damage, it will split apart, revealing a motorcycle escape vehicle. Later in the game, you get access to an EMP, a lock-on rocket launcher, and even a smoke screen. The way the game handles combat is fluid and fun, while also providing just the right amount of challenge. You're going to be facing a large selection of enemies, such as the classics like the Switchblade Prowlers, the Roadlord Superliners, and the bomb-dropping helicopters, along with some creative new inclusions, like these pickup truck maniacs or these Nostra guards dressed up like gondoliers. The basic cars go down easily enough with the standard machine gun, but it's the bigger trucks, tanks, and helicopters that you've got to worry about. Also, I do enjoy the fact that you can easily knock these pricks off their motorcycles. Later in the game, you'll have to fight against a few stolen interceptors, which sort of serve as mini boss battles, but not really. Literally, all you need to do is manage your supply of rockets, and you'll be able to take down any enemy without issue. Luckily, there are a bunch of weapons vans in each level that will refill your health and ammo if need be. So yeah, gameplay, it's really good. Let's talk about the visuals. Spyhunter wasn't the best looking game when it came out. There were plenty of graphically impressive console games out at the time, like Halo, GTA, Burnout. However, Spyhunter does surprisingly hold up quite well even 17 years later, all through little tricks from the developers. Tech-wise, the engine that Paradigm used is pretty standard. Ironically, their best work may have been the water physics, which are very underutilized. First, the waves that your car makes in the water is pretty fucking awesome. Look at this, which is hilarious because remember, Spyhunter is a driving game. You'll be driving past the waves, you won't be turning around. You won't be noticing any of this. Why did they even include this? Like seriously, look how smooth this water reacts to the interceptor. Remember, this was 2001, people. Also, the reflections are pretty good too. Destructibility and damage has also held up very well. While explosions and particle effects are definitely dated, the sheer number of destructible objects is incredible. The simple stuff like being able to blow yourself into a ship just to drive through it, blowing up everything inside just to jump back out, that never gets old. Destroying helicopters will also have them spin out of control, where they will literally always fall and explode right in front of the player no matter what, just to look cool. And hey, I can respect that. But where Spyhunter excels is the visual tone of the game. If you couldn't tell already, Spyhunter goes for a James Bond vibe in a realistic world, albeit with advanced technology and secret underground bases. It's clear from playing through this game that the artists have a clear understanding of a Bond film and the locations that it would be set in. The biggest advantage that these developers had was that they were making a linear driving game. This meant that they only had to work on the very paths that the players would be driving down. This little advantage is what keeps the SCS truck simulators looking gorgeous. Unlike GTA, which has to be a full real city, Spyhunter only needed to be a facade. On top of this, the game was all about fast driving, which meant that models and scenery didn't have to be overly detailed, because the player would just drive right by. Though even with these little tricks, Paradigm still went the extra mile to make these places as detailed as they could. Visually, models are very simplistic and textures are nothing more than decent. However, the designers have managed to cram a ton of stuff into a small linear road, and that's pretty impressive. Even still, Spyhunter is a treat to look at, and every setting is nailed perfectly, and these levels still look beautiful, especially for a 17-year-old game. One of my favorite examples is a level set in Venice. Here the devs could have gone the cheap route and had the entire game set on a flat river, with just water-based enemies. However, they constantly add in ramps and sections that take you back into the streets, and even has a restaurant that you can literally drive through. Then the game has a section where you fall into Nostra's underground base and start blowing shit up. The amount of detail in this single map is consistent for the entire game, and is what personally makes Spyhunter such a blast. You see, when the devs at Paradigm were coming up with these levels, some of the very first concept art drawn included the very locations and settings that the game would have. Often in most games, the course itself is planned out, and then scenery and aesthetic is added in later. But for Spyhunter, the artist had a big hand in the design process from day one, and the gameplay really reflects that. For example, on a level like Germany, you'll be driving down nice smooth highways through small European villages and even an old castle. Meanwhile, down in Panama, you'll have to navigate through a rough, dirty road into a large river, and at one point you can break into a Nostra ship and finally escape through the canal system. The variety on offer on each level is pretty cool, and I think it has been hard-coded into the game's very design. Though, one complaint I do have with the levels is how a few are reused, usually with something extending onto it. So whereas the first level might look like this, the new one would look like this. I honestly consider this to be kind of a cheap out, but unfortunately I don't have any information as to why they did this. It might seriously have been money issues, as Paradigm weren't exactly a big name studio, and this would be the one and only Spyhunter game that they would ever work on. However, at the end of the day, these levels are fast, fun, detailed, and have a lot of replayability, which is all I can ask for. One other big element that has aged really well in Spyhunter is the sound design. God, this soundtrack is superb, and it nails the retro spy thriller theme that the game was going for. Music can range from chill and relaxed, resulting in one of my favorite menu tracks. Then during a level, it can ramp up to a simple yet exciting score. Some of the tracks are forgettable, but a select few, especially the ones that contain the Peter Gunn theme, really stand out. As for the sound effects, Spyhunter is no slacker. Everything from the sound of shooting a truck to smithereens, to the alarms of a secret base, to the voice of the Interceptor's computer, it all comes together nicely. I especially love the sound the Interceptor makes when transforming. I don't know why, but that sound is stuck inside my brain. I also love how helicopters make the same sound effect when dropping bombs as they did in the original. Spyhunter was ported to a number of systems, though the PS2 port, which came out in fall of 2001, seems to be the highest rated. Second to that is the Xbox port, followed by the GameCube port, and last and certainly least is the PC port, all of which hitting shelves in the spring of the following year. All of these ports at least have the same game, though the PC port apparently has sluggish controls and lost many graphical and gameplay features. Also, the game did receive two portable versions, one for the Game Boy Advance and one for the Tapwave Zodiac. Yeah, does anyone remember this thing? The Game Boy port was pretty standard, but apparently the Zodiac version was very good, as it's considered one of the best games on the console. While the game Spyhunter is pretty cheap, going for only about $15 or so, the Zodiacs themselves sell for an upward of $500, so I'd only recommend this version to diehard fans or anyone who already happens to own a Zodiac. I need to mention how I'm currently playing this game. I have to play Spyhunter through an emulator, a PS2 emulator of all things. This game did have a PC port, but as I said earlier, it was complete garbage. It's your standard lazy PC port with horrible modern optimization, limited options and settings, that type of shit. So I decided to risk playing it through an emulator just to get the full authentic experience. Also, if that wasn't strange enough, the version I was used to playing as a kid was the Xbox version, not the PlayStation. However, the PS2 emulator is a lot easier to get up and running, so that's what I decided to go with. I also didn't want to have to record directly from my old Xbox. I know some people have a fond memory for the staticky, low-resolution blurriness, but not me. I love a lot of old things, but standard def ain't one of them. If I know that any game can be played at a crisp 1080p resolution, I will walk through hell just to make it so. And with an emulator, I can do that. Sort of. The emulator did have some problems with certain textures, including the skybox and review mirror breaking on certain resolutions, though aside from these, it did run smoothly. The general consensus on Spyhunter when it came out seemed to be mixed, though with mostly favorable reviews. People seemed to enjoy the arcade-style action, and many were pleased at its respect towards the original games, while also being confident enough to try something new. Unfortunately, as time has moved on, the opinions on Spyhunter have humorously become polarized. There are some cynical retro gamers that consider this game to be terrible and not worth anyone's time, while plenty of other gamers, the few who still remember this game, love it as a classic, and guys, I happen to be one of them. I believe the main culprit behind Spyhunter's fade into obscurity to be Midway themselves. Not only was Spyhunter another arcade remake for home consoles, but it was yet another arcade racing game, of which Midway was pumping out dozens at the time. So Spyhunter was lumped in with the rest of these mediocre titles, and the reboot was eventually forgotten. But remember, this game did have a few sequels and is itself a sequel. So let's take a brief look at the rest of the Spyhunter games. I honestly don't have much to say about the original games that hasn't already been said. There are hundreds of videos covering the arcade games, and my opinions are the same as everyone else. The arcade game is fun but really challenging. The NES port is pretty good, and Super Spyhunter is fun, though for me only in short bursts. They're good games, and I'd recommend them to anyone interested in retro games, but not to casual players, as they are really difficult. However, I'm not here to talk about old Spyhunter. Rather, I want to discuss the Reboot series. With Spyhunter 2001's moderate success, a sequel was made, but not by the original developers. Instead, the game was passed over to Rockstar San Diego. Of course, today, they're a very big company, responsible for some of the latter Midnight Club games and Red Dead Redemption. Unfortunately, this game wasn't one of their best ones. Spyhunter 2, released in 2003, is a decent game. It picks up right where Spyhunter 1 left off and continues the story. Its controls are pretty solid and gameplay is good. Unfortunately, this game was a real slog to play through. So what do I not like about Spyhunter 2? Well, most of it has to do with just preferences and tonal choices made in the first Spyhunter that seem painfully absent here. Many of the things that really immersed me in Spyhunter 1 were tiny tweaks and mechanics that, while unimportant on their own, really added to the theme. I think the test course in the first Spyhunter is a good example of how the original game was superior to the sequel. This mostly has to do with little touches that the level designers added in. Stuff like having your path be marked by cones, having real wooden targets, everything that made the test track feel like a real test track and not like a boring tutorial. But in the sequel, it fails on every level, opting for a very generic tutorial mission. Spyhunter 1 rode the line between science fiction and modern day, which in a way gave it its own style. Everything seemed believable and barely required a stretch of the imagination. It's what the James Bond films have gotten away with for the last 50 years, and it works. Spyhunter 2, however, doesn't quite follow this design philosophy. Instead, Spyhunter 2 feels like it's in an alternate reality, and I have two theories why. First, the design of everything is just off. Cars and vehicles just don't feel real. I know Spyhunter 1 wasn't exactly a simulation, but the bad guys had normal looking equipment that any military could get. Regular trucks, regular boats. Here, the vehicles look straight out of a shitty sci-fi film, with elaborate designs and the most annoying thing, a lot of glowing lights. Like seriously, this looks like shit you'd see in Batman and Robin, not James Bond. Secondly, the level design ruins the setting. I'm just going to say this up front, Spyhunter 2's level design is a shitty downgrade from what we got in Spyhunter 1. Spyhunter 1 alternated between tight linear roads and large open spaces perfectly. The devs knew the risk of adding in too many large areas in an arcade driving game, so when these spaces did open up, they made sure the player knew exactly where they were going. Meanwhile, Spyhunter 2 rarely has you traversing through crowded urban areas, because that was too fun or something, right guys? Instead, it places you in barren open roads. Once you do enter a city, there's no one around. Literally, the first level has you go into a Russian city that was taken straight out of GoldenEye, but it doesn't add in any pedestrians or civilians or anyone at all. For all I know, this is a post-apocalyptic game. Keep in mind, Spyhunter 1 was the game where you could accidentally drive through an F1 racetrack with a bunch of other race cars. That's fucking awesome. The sequel also lacks any real secrets or alternate routes that was very present in Spyhunter 1. Occasionally you might find one, but not on every level. Instead, the game forces you down huge empty roads with just a single objective to worry about. This also makes the game look horribly outdated and ugly. The graphics are objectively better than the first game, but it's hard to notice because while Spyhunter 1 had densely populated levels, this one has empty, lifeless ones. One thing many low-budget games understood was that adding in a lot of detail, even to a small narrow road or path, does a lot. My favorite example is Resident Evil 4. That game's world is just a bunch of narrow pathways and small buildings, but the designers added in so much foliage, props, and geographical details that you never even notice, and to this day, it still looks fantastic. But here, just look at all the nothingness. Hey, why not add in a few more trees here? Or how about a few more buildings right here? Look at the first level in Spyhunter 1, where you drive onto a regular freeway. Look at all these cars. Now once you enter the town, look at all these little details. This is a real world and does not feel like a video game. Spyhunter 2 just fails this. Also, the game has a lot of annoying gameplay sections. The worst two are the ones where it encloses you in a large arena to fight other cars, or ones that literally puts you into a fucking turret. Are you kidding me? So Spyhunter 2 is a tragic story. Underneath the surface, there is a good game. The controls are smooth, the action is pretty fun, but unfortunately, without any identity to make it stand out, it's just boring. It's a shame because with a bit of tweaking, like changing some models, closing some open spaces, even changing the soundtrack, this game could have held up. But now we're moving on to another sequel, Spyhunter: Nowhere to Run. The less said, the better. Released in 2006 by Terminal Reality, Spyhunter: Nowhere to Run was meant to tie in with the planned Spyhunter movie, which never happened. So the game was released on its own. Basically, it has The Rock and features a lot less of the Interceptor in favor of lazy third-person action. Yes, a series all about driving a car consists mostly of third-person brawling. The driving, while lacking any depth, is pretty fun, and the only thing that partially saves the game is The Rock's inclusion, especially when some of his wrestling moves actually made it in. The audacity of the developers is pretty funny. However, Spyhunter: Nowhere to Run doesn't quite reach so bad it's good territory, and is instead just boring and repetitive. Honestly, the only interesting part of this game is the planned movie that it was tied to. Since 2003, Universal has been trying to piece together a movie with seemingly no luck. The directors and screenwriters have come and gone, such as John Woo, Paul W.S. Anderson, And the latest one, Ruben Fleischer. The only consistency so far is The Rock's inclusion, and nothing else. Eventually, the rights left Universal and landed at Warner Brothers, who confirmed that they were in fact still working on it, but it's highly doubtful at this point. As for this shitty attempt at a tie-in game, I would recommend to stay away. I can smell what The Rock's cooking, and it's a big pile of shit. Finally, we've reached the latest entry in the series, Spyhunter 2012. Another reboot that came out in 2012 for the 3DS and Vita. So far, this game has been the most polarizing one in this series, mostly due to just how few people are even talking about it. Half the reviews say it's garbage, while the other half say it's fun. And that's pretty much it. After watching the negative reviews, it becomes clear that none of these reviewers have even heard of the 2001 incarnation, which this game is heavily influenced on. Instead, they think it's trying to be a direct remake of the original Spyhunter, and that only complicates things. The consistent critiques that I've heard about this game is the less than stellar controls, long load times, and a large amount of lag on the Vita port. As for good things, well, the game seems to have similar gameplay as to the 2001 reboot. You'll be blasting through well-designed levels and shooting at bad guys in a James Bond aesthetic. Also, this game, while easy to pick up, can apparently get pretty challenging and has a lot of content on offer, though that's all I've heard. Also, I think this Interceptor is better than the Spyhunter 2 Interceptor. That's right, fight me. So far, no other games have even been announced, and unfortunately, if another one ever is, I suspect it'll either be a low-budget portable game, or a remake, or some type of re-release of the old arcade game. With Midway gone, Warner Brothers has full control, and I seriously doubt that they'd have any big plans, which is a shame. While Spyhunter 1 had some problems, it was overall a great reboot that managed to turn a simple high-score arcade game into a fantastic driving game. The success of this one game led to 2 sequels, a potential film, and another reboot that, despite being made more than 10 years later, still heavily borrowed from the first game. Unfortunately, none of the other games have managed to replicate or improve upon Spyhunter. Instead, they each try to do their own thing, but ultimately weren't brave enough to fully commit. So they instead fell back on the heavy lifting all done by the first game. Spyhunter 2 feels like it's trying to be a science fiction car combat game, and that Spyhunter is just holding it back. Spyhunter Nowhere to Run has no fucking clue what it wants to be, and Spyhunter on the 3DS and Vita is actually pretty faithful to Spyhunter, though it should have gotten a lot more polish. If I were to categorize these games as James Bond movies, here's how I would do it. The original Spyhunter games are somewhere in the old Connery Bond films. They're old, they have some problems, but overall they're very good classics that brought a lot of fun and action to the industry. Spyhunter 2001 feels a bit like GoldenEye. In an era of bad reboots, this one managed to retain the spirit of the original, though made itself its own identity with more over-the-top action and a bit of goofiness along the way. Spyhunter 2 feels like Die Another Day. Yeah, it might have a few pieces of a good foundation, but it's ultimately ruined by its disconnect with the series. Spyhunter Nowhere to Run feels like Get Smart, and Spyhunter 2012 feels like James Bond Jr. Enough said. I don't think another big multi-platform Spyhunter game is ever going to see the light of day. Knowing the industry right now, Warner Brothers wouldn't dare try to take that kind of risk. And even if they did, it would probably be so far from Spyhunter that it would be a completely different game. They'd probably try to cram some sort of multiplayer mode into it, maybe try to make it open world, thereby stripping away any identity it may have once had. So I'm not on the edge of my seat for a sequel. So what's my history with Spyhunter? Well, believe it or not, but this game might have a bigger role in my life as a gamer than I even realized. Before I had a PC, or even a 360, before I played the latest Nintendo games, I was a very casual gamer. I had an old Game Boy SP, and that was it. However, my dad had the original Xbox. He had a number of games, but the one that he played the most was, you guessed it, Spyhunter. I distinctly remember watching him play this game on our large TV, and I specifically remember thinking that this game looked just as good as a movie. This in turn got me more interested in video games as a little kid, and eventually I inherited his Xbox. I browsed through my dad's collection, and as much as I loved Spyhunter, there was just one other game that managed to beat it for my attention: the original Halo. This was my first experience with a true FPS game. From there, I eventually got a 360 and later got online support, which opened my world even more. Finally, I made the jump to the PC Master Race, and here I am today, with a fond love of first-person shooters. However, Spyhunter has a fond place in my memory and a soft place in my heart. So what are my final thoughts on this game? Well, what can I say? I still love it. While most gamers would consider this game to be just good, I think my memory with it propels it into personal favorite territory. God, I love this game, and going through it for the first time in so long just brings back good memories. Also, many people seem to have a favorite fictional car that, if they could, they would want to own the real thing. Stuff like Knight Rider, the General Lee, a DeLorean, and definitely a few of the Bond cars. For me, it's the G6155 Interceptor. There's something about its design that makes it look really slick, but not in that pompous fashion designer way. It's intimidating, it's tough, it can transform into a boat and shoot fucking rockets. Need I say more? For new players who are on the fence, I definitely recommend it. If you want to go through the hassle of emulating it, I'd say it's worth the risk, as the game holds up surprisingly well in higher resolutions. Granted, if you can get it working without any bugs. Otherwise, if you're going to play this game legitimately, stick with the PS2 port. The Xbox and GameCube are almost as good, but the PC version is a poor downgrade of the original, so just steer clear of that one. Spyhunter isn't a game about realistic driving physics, or about a well-written plot, or even about deep puzzling level design. It's a fun, action-filled adventure that manages to capture the tone and spirit of great spy movies, while also adding in a good amount of replayability and challenge. It's quite literally an entire game based around exciting car chases, and no other game can even come close. So if you've ever wanted to play a game where you take the role of James Bond, driving through a crowded city as bad guys chase him, hey, this is your game. If you enjoyed the video and like to see more, please subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. Otherwise, I'm Inspector Magnum, and thanks for watching.